Hello and welcome to this appointment of the Baby Brains Annual Conference. This year we discuss the topic of freedom within reality. So we think about the limits and we look at them and we look what's good about them and what, in a way, how freedom can express itself in the actual reality we are living in. We've been talking with Anna Gui and Antonia Jordan Barros over the last few days, some of your disciples, Emily.
Brilliant.
You've been called an illuminated professor by then. So thank you so much for being here with us today, talking about neurodiversity and why it is good to find out early or not. We'll see. So thank you so much for coming.
Really? Well, thank you for having me, Silver. It's lovely to be back with you guys.
Thank you. And could you please start by introducing yourself?
Sure. So I'm Emily Jones, and I'm a professor at the Centre for Brain and Cognitive Development in London. And my research program is all about understanding the early development of neurodiverse populations. So how do children develop? What might influence where they end up, and what might help them to succeed.
Yeah. So. Thank you so much. And so you are like a really world-leading expert in early developmental neurodiversity, and it's fantastic that you take the time to be here and that you make this time to communicate with people that are out there, because it's really incredible to see how you reach out to people. Like your research is not just about staying in your bubble and like publishing the papers, which you also do, but it's also kind of really making sure that this research is useful to actual people out there. So we're really glad that we can benefit from that. So this year we're talking about limits, as we were saying, and about the environment and how that influences the way a person can develop, fulfill their own potential. And so over the last few interviews as well, we had this question: does the person have to fit a particular environment, or is it the environment that can fit around the question? So what do you think?
It's a great question, Sylvia. So I think, in reality, it's always a bit of both, right? But I think one of the interesting things is that this changes massively over developmental time. So when babies are first born, they have very little ability to shape the environment around them. And so, of course, their early environment is going to be really scaffolded by their parents, by, as they get a little bit older, by preschool, by the people around them. But as children, increasingly grow and develop their own autonomy, they start creating their own environment. So they might start by, choosing the toys they want to play with, or choosing their friends. And as they get older, they'll choose their friendship group. They might choose their school. They'll choose their job. And so I think through development, people have more and more ability to construct an environment that fits them. And so I think one thing that's really important is to invest in early years to make sure that when that environment is more kind of created from the outside for children, that we make that environment adapted to them also, because I think that's the bit that the child themselves don't have any control over. And so I think that's one interesting thing. And I think the sort of way that brain development works is that there is always this interaction between the brain kind of adapting to the environment that it's in, and then the brain constructing the environment that it wants. And so I think understanding some of that can really help us understand children who might be neurodivergent or might be developing differently, and what kinds of things might help both scaffold them to reach their full potential, but might also help them figure out how can they construct an environment that works for them.
Yeah, because often, as things are now, neurodiversity is probably perceived mostly as a limit, as something that blocks a child or a person from benefiting from everything that society has to offer, or that, just has an experience of life that is more complicated or more difficult. Does it have to be this way, do you think? Is there a way that we can think about neurodiversity and act upon it that can change things a little bit?
Definitely. So I think, one thing is that the sort of terminology here is always difficult. And so often when we're talking about neurodiversity, we mean, the whole range of children and all the different ways in which children can be different from each other. And there's going to be things within that are more challenging for children to get over, or for children to adapt to. And there'll be things within that might be seen or perceived by society at the moment as a challenge, but actually a real strength. So, I mean, one thing that we all need to be thinking about is where are there individual differences in children that actually are disabling to the child because society makes it that way, in a way that doesn't need to be the case. So, prejudice and stigma and discrimination and all those things can disable a child from the outside because of an individual difference they have. And so that's something that we can, clearly change. So making sure that we remove stigma around autism, for example, we remove some of the limitations that are placed on autistic people. Those sorts of things can make a massive difference in terms of stopping things be a limit that maybe are at the moment because of societal challenges. And then on the flip side, there are always going to be things that that in the child might mean that child needs extra support. So not just kind of barriers taken out of their way, but also supports and adaptations made to help them live a full life. So, the most obvious examples are sort of physical mobility differences where you might need a wheelchair. But there are also things that, if you find the environment noisy, noise cancelling headphones can make a massive difference. So there are areas where, even really simple supports can really reduce the limitations that someone might experience based on some of their individual differences. But I think the other thing to say is that this doesn't mean that we're trying to pretend that there aren't real challenges for some children and some families, and it's really important that doesn't get minimized. So there are still real needs for kind of support and resource and help for some children to really help them have a really good quality of life.
Yeah, I guess it kind of goes back to what we were saying before about the kind of mutual fitting each other and informing each other and influencing each other. And so, from the environment to the person and from the person to the environment. And so maybe a question that parents can ask themselves is, am I trying to do everything possible to make sure my child fits in the little case that society has prepared for them? Or am I trying to build a bridge here in between an individual and a society? And if the bridge is built in a good way, then maybe both can benefit from each other as good as possible. And so maybe it's kind of a little bit of a shift that for parents could be very useful as well in thinking about it.
I think that's absolutely true, because I think there's definitely some evidence that if, and sometimes as a parent you're sort of made to feel by professionals, by clinicians, that there are limits on your child's future, and that's something that you can't change. And whilst certainly there may be things your child's experiencing that are going to constrain the different options available to you, like you say, that shouldn't be seen as kind of a box that they always have to stay within. It should be always be able to feel like you can help your child achieve as much as they can, in order that they have a good quality of life, which is ultimately what we're always trying to think about. So I think you're absolutely right. Not allowing other people to tell you that your child can't do this or can't do that necessarily. That you can think about, well, how can we help my child to certainly experience different things and have that good quality of life.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you're saying quality of life, and I think it kind of goes beyond neurodiversity and autism. It's probably all of us parents that might have specific expectations about our child and what we think would be amazing for them to do with their life, and then maybe a reality kicks in and it's not exactly that thing. And it's this also obsessing about wanting my child to be like a super achiever in something. Might be a source of frustration, which then in the end doesn't really add to quality of life of anyone. So it's really this work of interacting with each other and adapting and making the most of what we've got there, which is tough for parents and particularly for parents of children that have a neurodiversity. So in any way we want to minimize the specific challenges that are there, and yet we are actually thankful for the image and inspiration that they give to all parents.
Absolutely. And I think one important thing is it has to also be a broader part of society, not just parents, because I think one thing parents often feel is it's all put on them, right? It's all up to them to have to find their child's way in the world and provide their child with support, whereas really it should be a whole society kind of function to all be working together to support both the child and their family, because it's something that often we all need support, right, with our children and how to help them.
Absolutely. This makes me think. I was interviewing a mother the other day of two autistic children, and I was asking her, what could we as a society do
Mhm.
for like, normal people around you, not necessarily the government, but like people
Yeah.
that you bump into every day. And she said something that really touched me. She said, "Sometimes I need you to love my children for me. Sometimes it's
Yeah.
for me to love my child because it's just hard, you know." Um,
Yeah.
Autism sometimes really makes relationships different or more hard to kind of feel that reward that we all
Mm.
crave. And so, how important it is that the whole of society, as you were saying, is actually aware of that, and
Mm.
it's an actual thing to find out, like to be curious about these people and to try to find what's good about them, what's nice in the interaction with them, and actually do it because yeah, parents are really needing that support.
Mm.
Yeah. So in terms of finding out about autism, for example, um, it's becoming more and more possible to have a diagnosis earlier and earlier, or to have
Mhm.
signs. Um, what is good about finding out early?
Yeah, I think it's all about what the child needs at that time. So certainly I think what a lot of parents go through is they first notice that their child's struggling with something a long time before they can get a diagnosis. And so that means they're going through this long period of taking their child to different doctors or being on waiting lists, being told, oh, we're not sure, we're going to wait. And that's a long time that they're A, not receiving any support, but B, they're in this state of kind of uncertainty as to what's happening and, what they can do. And so I think that process is really stressful and can put a huge amount of burden on a family, just in terms of engaging with the medical clinical systems. So I think for some children, just really reducing that gap between when parents first think, do you know what, my child needs some help with something, and when they can access that help and support, which sometimes you need a diagnosis to access effectively, because that's the sort of route in a lot of healthcare systems. So I think in that circumstance, it can be really positive for parents to remove that whole period where their child's not getting very much, they're stressed, no one knows what to do. That can put huge amounts of pressure on people. So I think for children where they are struggling kind of in the moment, and they really need something beyond what their parents can provide, I think early diagnosis or early identification can be really, really valuable. And then the other side of it is that we think that putting in supports at that point early on might help the child to then build up some of the skills that are going to be important later on. So if the child can kind of develop some early skills that then help them in that transition to secondary school, where it can be really difficult for autistic children. Sometimes they're going into a really different environment. Sometimes knowing about their diagnosis before, that can really help, because they might have already identified some things that might help them cope, so that big transition doesn't become such a stressful thing for them. So I think the other advantage is that sometimes for some children, just being able to help them figure out how, again, like you said, how they can adapt the environment to suit them, gives them those tools that then they've got longer to use, rather than spending a long period of their development, not understanding.
Yeah, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And there are some risks that are associated with that as well. Some things that maybe are not that ideal. So, what do you think about those?
There are, and I think it's really important to talk about this, because I think sometimes early intervention, early detection gets presented as sort of universally positive, and of course we want to do that. But there are certainly risks. I mean, there's sort of both societal risks and kind of individual risks. So societally, there is a risk that if you're detecting something early, the perception becomes that it's a negative, or it's a bad thing that it is you're identifying. And of course, what has happened in some genetic conditions is that if, for example, you can do prenatal testing for a condition, then parents are worried about what the impact of that genetic condition might be, and so some families will choose abortion or other approaches. And obviously that worries a lot of autistic people, that might be the way that some families would decide to go if they had a prenatal diagnosis of autism, for example, in a way that wouldn't recognize the benefits and the value of neurodiversity, and valuing every child for their own skills. So there are societal worries around increasing stigma and those sorts of concerns. But I think for individual children, there also can be downsides. So if, for example, your child doesn't necessarily need very many supports, it might be something that they would want to be part of the decision making around as to whether they want to kind of embrace an autistic identity, whether they want the diagnostic label, whether they don't. So we work with some families who have, a parent who's autistic or an older child who's autistic, and they have a younger child who they think probably shows some of the traits, but they don't feel like the child needs a diagnosis in that moment. And so they want to wait until the child gets a bit older and they can participate in the decision making around, do they want that label or do they not? And people make different decisions about that. So I think it's certainly worth thinking about that in terms of if your child needs services now, then absolutely probably the best thing is to seek those services at that point. But if they don't, maybe they can participate in the decision making when they get a little bit older.
Yeah, and I guess to make an informed decision about this, it would be ideal that sort of the whole population got more educated about what autism is and how it can manifest itself, because of course what's complex about it is the whole diversity in it, and how it's not just it's difficult to pick up on, and so a little bit of more education in the wider population would be so valuable, and it would really inform the type of decision you want to make about that.
Exactly. Because for a lot of autistic people, what they don't necessarily need any treatment or intervention or therapy, and they don't want those things. What they want is for society to recognize just the different way in which they communicate, or the different way in which they might want to be in the world, or the way in which the sensory environment can impact them. And so how can we reduce the number of flickering lights and loud noises and things that actually benefit an awful lot of people. And so I think, we definitely want to be moving towards the kind of what some people call a neurodiversity affirmative approach, where you're just trying to change the environment so it's suited to a wide range of neurodivergent and non-neurodivergent people, rather than having to, put some people in a box and say, well, you need this sort of special circumstances. We're actually trying to, have a rising tide raise all boats. I think that's definitely where we want to get to.
Yeah, that sounds like a wonderful society where we can all rejoice in diversity. There is a long way to go, but it's fantastic to know that there are people like you that put so much resources and energy and time and devotion to doing this. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
And to conclude, you have like a story maybe of a limit that can have in the end turn out to be a strength.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that we often see in autistic people is the ability to hyper-focus, so to really focus on a particular activity or interest or skill. So it might be drawing, it might be art, it might be numbers. So some children are really interested in numbers or really interested in letters, and so can read super early. And sometimes in school that can be perceived as a limit because children don't want to do what the teacher says and are still focusing on the art activity when they're supposed to have gone out to play. And it can be something that people perceive as a special interest or as something that's disruptive. But actually and again, this kind of goes back to our shaping your own environment, as children grow up and they can increasingly shape their interests and what they want to do, often children who have those kind of really hyper-focused interests have a superpower effectively at being able to concentrate, at being able to reach really high levels of achievement within that particular skill. It might be chess, might be drawing, lots of different examples. And there's lots of autistic people where that then becomes their career and they're incredibly successful. So I think that's a nice example of how something that could be perceived as a limit at one point in development, actually, if you flip it around, it brings real strength to an individual if you can allow them to shape the environment around them to allow them to benefit from that.
Yeah, so I guess for parents of both children with autism and children without autism, kind of thinking about how we can observe what their interests are, however strong or light they might be, and if we can think about ways that we can again build a bridge with the environment and tailor the environment around them so that can help towards that quality of life you were talking about. Then I guess that's a big job that us parents have to do.
Exactly. So and I think it's something that a lot of parents do just naturally. So find the things that your child, finds joy in, and try to help them do more of that. What do they enjoy? What are they interested in? And give them those opportunities wherever you can. And I think that's something that a lot of parents do naturally. And I think that's certainly something that seems to be the best approach.
Well, on these wise words, I would really like to thank you, Emily. Thank you so much for being with us, Professor Emily Jones, and hopefully see you soon
Yeah, see you soon. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Have a
Take
lovely
care.
afternoon.
You
Bye.
too. Bye.